The cafe's shadow. The morning sun filtered through the tall glass windows of Beaumont Café, the most popular yet most uneasy place in the city's downtown district. Its name carried prestige. Famous artists, businessmen, and politicians had dined there over the years. The marble floors gleamed, the chandeliers sparkled with soft golden light, and the aroma of freshly ground coffee beans lingered in the air. On the surface it was the very picture of elegance. But beneath that beauty lived something darker, something that every worker felt in the pit of their stomach whenever they heard the familiar roar of an expensive engine pulling up outside. For when Richard Allister, the millionaire tycoon, arrived, the cafe's warm air turned cold, and the staff braced themselves for the storm. Richard was not the kind of man who simply walked into a place. He invaded it. His tall frame, designer suits, and piercing eyes commanded attention, but not admiration. His wealth bought him everything except respect. Customers and staff alike feared him, because respect cannot be purchased. It must be earned, and Richard had long abandoned that truth. He was known for cruel remarks, for humiliating waiters if his coffee was even 1 degree cooler than he liked, for mocking the clothes of those who served him, and for tossing bills on the floor just to watch a server pick them up. And yet, no one spoke against him. The cafe staff depended on their jobs, and the regular customers depended on the peace of avoiding conflict. Silence became survival whenever Richard Allister stepped inside. This morning was no different. The sleek black limousine rolled up to the curb outside the cafe, its polished surface reflecting the sunlight like a mirror. Conversations within the cafe hushed. A man folded his newspaper and cleared his throat nervously. A couple in the corner tightened their hands to get her. Behind the counter, Marcus, the head waiter with 15 years of service, exchanged a nervous glance with the barista, a young woman named Anna, who immediately pretended to be busy with the espresso machine. Richard was coming, and they all knew the routine: polish your smile, perfect your posture, and prepare to endure. The heavy glass doors swung open, and there he was. Richard's presence sucked the air from the room. His shoes clicked sharply against the floor, echoing like a judge's gavel in a courtroom. He glanced around as if surveying a kingdom he owned, lips curling into a smirk that suggested everyone else was beneath him. He removed his sunglasses slowly, a gesture that felt more like a performance than necessity. His eyes were sharp, predatory, scanning the staff as though daring someone to displease him. He slid into his usual corner booth, the one reserved exclusively for him, and snapped his fingers. Instantly, Marcus rushed forward with the menu, though he already knew Richard's breakfast order by heart. "Good morning, sir," Marcus said, forcing a polite tone, though sweat beaded his forehead. "Good morning," Richard sneered. "What's good about it? Your staff still don't know how to serve with speed. I've been sitting here 5 seconds already." He leaned back and waved dismissively, his arrogance dripping from every syllable. Marcus bowed his head quickly, muttered an apology, and hurried away. The cafe relaxed only slightly, but the shadow of Richard's cruelty still hung heavy. Customers whispered behind their menus, careful not to be heard. They had seen it before. Last week, he had called Anna useless because her hands shook slightly while pouring his coffee. A month ago, he had reduced a young trainee to tears when she dropped his spoon by accident. And still, no one ever stood up to him. Today, however, would not be like every other day. Because today there was someone new. Her name was Maya Johnson. She had started just 2 days earlier, a young black woman in her mid-20s with eyes that carried both warmth and fire. Maya was no stranger to hard work. She had grown up in a neighborhood where dreams were often crushed by reality, yet she had fought to keep hers alive. She had taken this job not only to support her younger sister back home, but also because she believed in dignity of labor. Whether you were sweeping floors or serving coffee, your worth was not measured by what you did, but by how you did it. And Maya carried herself with quiet dignity. This morning, as Richard barked his complaints and staff scrambled, Maya watched carefully. She noticed how every worker stiffened around him, how fear dictated their every movement. She noticed the silence of the customers, who pretended not to hear cruelty unfolding right in front of them. And in that silence, Maya felt something stir inside her. She had seen arrogance before, but she had also seen the damage silence can cause. Too many times in her own life she had watched people ignore injustice because speaking out was inconvenient, but Maya was not built for silence. Still, she knew she had to be smart. Walking over to Richard's booth, tray in hand, she introduced herself with steady composure. "Good morning, sir. My name is Maya, and I'll be assisting with your order today." Richard looked her over slowly, his eyes narrowing in that way he did when he was deciding how best to break someone's spirit. His smirk deepened. "New, aren't you? Let's hope you last longer than the last girl." He chuckled, his words coated in venom, making Marcus flinch from across the room. But Maya didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she stood tall, her voice steady. "I plan to, sir." The cafe froze. It wasn't what she said, but how she said it, with calm assurance, not submissive fear rich. Bard raised an eyebrow, clearly unsettled that she hadn't cowered. He leaned forward, his voice dropping into a low growl meant only for her. "You think you're different? You'll learn. They all learn." Maya met his gaze evenly, her face unshaken. "Maybe," she said softly, "but maybe some people never learn when to stop." She placed his coffee gently on the table, turned, and walked away with perfect composure. The silence that followed was unlike any the cafe had ever known. Customers held their breath. Staff exchanged stunned glances. For the first time in years, someone had not only faced Richard Allister, but had done so without anger or fear, just simple, undeniable dignity. Richard sat back in his booth, his smirk faltering for the briefest of moments. Something in her words pierced through his armor, though he would never admit it. His pride surged back, fueling his resolve. He wasn't about to let a waitress of all people challenge him in public. Not here, not in his city. He would crush her, just like he had crushed everyone else who dared to stand tall in his shadow. But what Richard didn't know was that Maya was not like everyone else. She had weathered storms he couldn't imagine. And she wasn't just another waitress. She was the change he never saw coming. The cafe, once ruled by fear, now carried a different kind of silence, a charged silence, heavy with anticipation. The storm was coming, but this time it wasn't Richard who controlled it. It was Maya. The first stand. The morning's tension lingered in the air long after Maya had walked away from Richard's booth. The cafe, usually filled with the soft hum of conversation and clinking of cups, seemed caught in a strange stillness. Customers whispered cautiously, their eyes darting between the new waitress and the millionaire who had long terrorized this place. For years, Richard's sharp tongue and deep pockets had been enough to silence anyone who dared to cross him. But this morning, a young black woman with calm dignity had deflected his arrogance like it was nothing. And in that small act of defiance, something shifted, not just in the cafe, but in Richard himself. Richard sat in his corner booth, his fingers drumming against the table, his jaw set tight. He replayed her words in his mind. Maybe some people never learn when to stop. That wasn't just a remark, it was a challenge. And challenges were something Richard never tolerated. He had built his empire not only on wealth but on domination. Anyone who resisted him, business partners, employees, even his so-called friends, had all learned the cost of standing against Richard Allister. But this young woman, a waitress? She had looked him straight in the eye and walked away unshaken. It rattled him, though he would never admit it. Maya, meanwhile, moved through the cafe with deliberate composure, taking orders, serving with warmth, and offering polite smiles to customers who looked at her with a mixture of awe and curiosity. Inside, her heart beat hard in her chest, but she refused to let fear take control. She had grown up in a world where intimidation was common, landlords who threatened her mother for late rent, street bullies who preyed on the weak, even teachers who doubted her potential simply because of where she came from. Each experience had carved into her a resilience that no wealthy tyrant could shake. Still, she knew sad. He had to be careful. One wrong move could cost her this job. And with it, the support she was providing for her younger sister Naomi back home. But Maya also knew something else. Silence was dangerous. Silence was what allowed men like Richard to grow powerful. And if everyone in this cafe had been silent until now, perhaps it was time someone broke that cycle. Richard sipped his coffee, scowling when it wasn't exactly how he liked it. His hand shot into the air and his voice boomed across the cafe. "Waitress!" His tone was sharp, commanding, the way one might call a servant rather than another human being. The room froze again. Marcus started forward instinctively, but Richard snapped, "Not you, the new one." Every eye turned to Maya. She set down the tray she was carrying, wiped her palms on her apron, and walked toward him with steady steps. She could feel the weight of everyone's gaze, the suspense that electrified the air, but she didn't let it shake her. She reached the booth, standing tall though her hands trembled slightly beneath the surface. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her tone even. Richard held up the coffee cup, tilting it just enough to spill a few drops onto the table. "This," he sneered, "is lukewarm. I don't drink anything lukewarm. I asked for hot coffee. Is it so hard to do something right in this place?" His voice dripped with disdain, loud enough for everyone to hear. Normally, this was the moment when a waiter would shrink, apologize, and scurry away. But Maya didn't move. She looked at the spilled drops of coffee, then raised her eyes to Richard's face. Her voice was calm, but her words carried a weight that silenced even the quiet murmurs of the cafe. "Sir," she said, "the coffee was brewed fresh and I brought it to you as soon as it was ready. If it has cooled in the time you've been sitting here, perhaps the problem is not the coffee." A sharp gasp rippled through the room. Customers shifted in their seats, unable to believe what they had just heard. Marcus froze behind the counter, his mouth slightly open. Even Anna, the barista, stopped mid-pour, her hands trembling. No one had ever dared to respond to Richard like that. For a moment Richard was stunned. His mouth opened, then closed, as though the sheer audacity of her reply had robbed him of words. But then his pride roared back, his face darkened, his jaw clenched, and his voice thundered. "How dare you speak to me like that? Do you have any idea who I am?" Maya held her ground. Her heart raced, but her eyes never wavered. "I know exactly who you are, sir," she said evenly. "But the better question is, do you remember who you are when you speak to people this way?" The silence that followed was heavy, almost unbearable. It wasn't just her words. It was the mirror she had just held up to him in front of everyone. Richard was furious, but beneath that fury was something he hadn't felt in years, the sting of truth. The cafe's patrons exchanged glances, their fear mingling with something else, admiration. They had all endured Richard's cruelty in silence, but this young woman had said aloud what many of them had thought for years. Richard leaned forward, his voice dropping into a cold hiss. "You think you're brave because you've embarrassed me in front of these nobodies? You'll regret this. I'll make sure of it." Maya didn't flinch. She placed her hands gently on the table, leaning slightly closer so that only he could hear her next words. "Sir, the only regret I have is that too many people have let you believe your money makes you better than them. It doesn't. And if speaking the truth costs me this job, then so be it." Then, without waiting for his reply, she straightened, picked up the coffee cup and walked back toward the counter with calm dignity. The cafe erupted, not with laughter or mockery, but with quiet applause. It started with a single customer at the far corner, then another, until the sound filled the room. Not loud, not mocking, but steady. An affirmation of courage. Richard's face flushed red, his pride torn between fury and humiliation. Never before had anyone dared to challenge him so directly, let alone a waitress. His fists clenched on the table, and his eyes burned with the promise of revenge. But beneath the anger, something unsettled churned deep inside him. For the first time, he wasn't sure if his wealth and power would be enough to silence this woman. And for Maya, though her chest heaved with adrenaline and her hands still trembled, a quiet strength settled within her. She hadn't just stood up to Richard Allister. She had shown everyone else in that cafe that fear was not the only option. But she knew this was just the beginning. Men like Richard didn't back down. He would come back harder, meaner, more determined to break her spirit. And when he did, she had to be ready. not just for herself, but for everyone who had watched her today and finally believed that the shadow of Richard Alastair could be pierced by the light of truth. The storm was only gathering strength, and the cafe, once a place of silent fear, was about to become the battleground where one waitress's courage would clash with a millionaire's pride, the challenge. The days that followed Maya's defiance became the most talked-about days in Beaumont Café's history. For years, the cafe had carried a silent tension whenever Richard Alastair entered, but now the silence was different. It was not just fear anymore, it was anticipation. Customers who had once avoided Richard's presence now lingered longer in hopes of seeing another clash between the arrogant millionaire and the courageous young waitress who had dared to speak truth to his face. Staff who had once bowed their heads now looked to Maya with quiet admiration, whispering her name as if it were a shield. Richard, however, could not let it go. His ego, inflated by years of unquestioned dominance, could not bear the sting of being challenged by a woman he considered beneath him. Every night, in his penthouse suite overlooking the glittering city, he replayed the scene over and over. Her calm voice, her steady eyes, the way the cafe had applauded her. It was like acid burning through his pride. He told himself it was nothing, that she was just a waitress and he was Richard Alastair, a man who could crush reputations with a word. Yet in the quiet of his empty home, he could still hear her voice echoing in his mind. Do you remember who you are when you speak to people this way? And so, he began to plan. If she had humiliated him in public, then he would return the favor. He would destroy her confidence, shatter her dignity, and show everyone in that cafe who truly held the power. It would not be enough to insult her. He would orchestrate a spectacle, one that would strip away her composure and leave her broken in front of those very people who now whispered her name with respect. Richard was no stranger to planning his attacks. Business rivals had learned that lesson painfully. This, however, was personal. The following Saturday, the cafe was more crowded than usual. Word had spread through the city's gossip channels, whispered in offices and dinner parties. Richard Alastair had been publicly defied, and not by a politician or a businessman, but by a waitress. People wanted to see what would happen next. When Richard's limousine pulled up to the curb, the crowd inside stiffened, but unlike before, their fear was mingled with curiosity. What would Maya do this time? What would Richard do? Maya arrived for her shift early that morning, her apron neatly tied, her hair pulled back, her expression calm, but her stomach tight with unease. She knew he would return. Men like Richard did not accept humiliation quietly. She had spent the night thinking of her younger sister Naomi, who often called her on the phone after long days. "Don't let them break you, Maya," Naomi had said, her voice full of pride. "You've always been the strongest person I know." Those words became her armor as she walked into the cafe. When Richard entered, the cafe fell silent again. But this time, instead of being invisible, Maya felt every eye turn to her. She knew what they expected. They wanted to see if she would stand again. She swallowed the nervousness rising in her throat and steadied her hands. Richard strode to his usual booth, his expression dark and calculating, but he was not alone. He had brought company. 3 men in tailored suits followed him, men who laughed too loudly and looked around with smug disdain. They were not here for coffee. They were here for the show. Richard sat down, spreading his arms across the booth as if he owned the room, and motioned for Maya with a sharp flick of his hand. She walked over slowly, tray balanced perfectly, though her heart thudded inside her chest. "Good morning, sir," she said evenly, her tone neither submissive nor mocking. Richard smirked. "Ah, the brave waitress. We meet again." His voice carried deliberately low, but enough for the crowd to hear. "I've been telling my friends here about you, how you seem to think you're above your station. Isn't that right, gentlemen?" The men chuckled cruelly, their eyes raking over Maya with disdain. "Hard to believe someone like her had the nerve," one said. Maya felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she refused to look away. "I'm just here to serve coffee, sir," she said calmly. Richard leaned forward, his eyes glittering with malice. No, not today. Today you're here to prove yourself. Let's see if you can serve without spilling, without trembling, without making a fool of yourself. Because you see, my dear, Courage in words is nothing. Courage under pressure is what matters. He snapped his fingers, and one of the men at his table pulled out a thick wad of cash, tossing it onto the table with a sneer. "Here's a game," Richard said loudly, his voice echoing in the hushed cafe. "If you can serve each of us without a mistake, you can keep this. But if you falter, if you spill so much as a drop, you'll leave this cafe for good. What do you say?" The cafe gasped. It was humiliation disguised as generosity, a trap carefully laid. Richard's eyes burned with satisfaction as he waited for her to refuse. He expected her to stammer, to back away, to prove that her bravery was only an illusion. But Maya did not back down. She looked at the cash, then at Richard, then at the faces of the men who laughed at her, and then she looked at the customers, at Marcus and Anna, at the staff who had suffered under Richard's cruelty for years. She saw in their eyes a desperate hope, a silent plea. If she backed down now, the fear would return. But if she stood her ground, maybe, just maybe, it would break Richard's hold on this place forever. So she straightened her shoulders and said, "Very well, sir. I accept your challenge." The cafe buzzed with whispers. Some shook their heads, certain she was walking into ruin. Others leaned forward eagerly, their hearts pounding with hers. Richard's smile widened, confident. He had trapped her. He leaned back, folding his arms, and watched as Maya carried the tray back to the counter. She picked up 4 steaming cups of coffee, balanced them carefully, and began the slow walk back to the booth. The room was silent except for the sound of her steady footsteps. Every eye was on her, every breath held. She could feel Richard's gaze boring into her, waiting for her hands to tremble, waiting for the tray to falter. But Maya walked with calm grace, her movements steady, her heart focused. She thought of Naomi's voice, of her mother's tired but encouraging smile, of every moment in her life where she had been told she was not enough, and of how she had proven them wrong by surviving, by enduring, by standing tall. She reached the table, lowering the tray with precise care. One by one she set the cups before Richard and his friends. Not a single drop spilled. The tray was empty, her hands still steady. The room erupted in quiet applause, then louder, until the cafe shook with the sound. Richard's face twisted with rage. His plan had failed. Instead of humiliation, Maya had earned admiration. Instead of silence, the cafe was alive with support for her. His friends shifted uncomfortably, their smirks fading under the weight of the crowd's approval. Maya looked directly at Richard and said softly, "Respect isn't given by money or power, sir. It's given by people when you treat them as human. That's a lesson worth more than any bet." The applause grew louder. Richard's fists clenched on the table, his pride cracking beneath the weight of her words. For the first time he felt the walls closing in, not from money or rivals, but from truth. And though the battle was far from over, everyone in that cafe knew it. The balance had shifted. The tyrant had been challenged and the waitress had won the first round, the truth unveiled. The cafe had never felt so alive. After Maya's graceful victory over Richard's cruel challenge, applause had rolled through the room like a wave breaking against stone, shattering years of silence. For the first time, the staff looked less like servants trapped in fear and more like people who believed in dignity again. The customers, too, carried themselves differently. Heads held a little higher, whispers buzzing with awe. It was as though the chains Richard had draped over the place had finally begun to crack. But Richard Allister was not a man who accepted defeat easily. As the clapping slowly died, he sat frozen in his booth, his jaw tight, his eyes dark, his fingers clawing into the leather seat beside him. To be outwitted, to be humiliated, to be made the fool in front of his own friends and a room full of strangers, this was not just an inconvenience. To Richard, it was an unforgivable insult, a wound to his pride that festered like poison. "Enough!" he roared suddenly, his voice booming across the cafe, slamming against the walls and silencing the last of the applause. The room tensed, but Maya stood steady, tray still in her hands, her eyes locked on him with calm determination. Richard rose from his seat, towering over her, his friends shifting uncomfortably behind him. He jabbed a finger toward her, his voice dripping with fury. "You think you're clever," he spat. "You think a waitress with a sharp tongue can embarrass me? You have no idea who you're dealing with. I built half this city with my money. I've crushed men with twice your courage and 10 times your brains. And you," he sneered, looking her up and down with open contempt, "you're nothing but a girl in an apron. Do you really think you can stand against me?" The cafe was silent again, the weight of his anger pressing down like a storm, but Maya didn't falter. She set the tray calmly on the counter. Beside her, wiped her hands on her apron, and then took a single step closer to him. When she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it carried clear and steady through the entire cafe. "I don't need to stand against you with money or power, Mr. Allister," she said. "The truth is enough. And the truth is something even you can't buy." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Richard blinked, confusion flickering across his face. "Truth?" he scoffed. "What truth could someone like you possibly know?" Maya held his gaze, her eyes unflinching. "The truth about how you've treated people. The truth about how you built your empire by crushing those who trusted you. The truth about the workers you left unpaid, the families you destroyed, the partners you betrayed. Do you want me to go on?" The room gasped. For years, rumors had circled about Richard's business practices, whispers of unpaid contractors, of employees discarded like trash, of deals sealed with intimidation rather than fairness. But no one had dared speak them aloud, not in front of him. And now a waitress had just dragged those shadows into the light. Richard's face twisted, fury and fear battling behind his eyes. "Lies," he snapped. "All lies. Who would believe you? A nobody?" But Maya didn't back down. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a folded slip of paper. "People believe evidence, Mr. Allister," she said softly, "and I've kept records, receipts, statements, names of workers who were cast aside. I've spoken to people who lost everything because of you. You may not know me, but I've known you long before this day." She unfolded the paper and held it in her hand, not showing it yet, but the mere sight of it was enough to send a ripple of shock through the cafe. Richard's face paled beneath his anger, his pride suddenly fighting against something stronger, fear. "You," his voice cracked, for a moment before he steadied it, forcing a harsh laugh. "This is absurd. You expect anyone here to believe that? You think a piece of paper can undo me?" Maya's eyes narrowed, her calm gaze cutting deeper than his fury. "It's not just a piece of paper, sir. It's a beginning, the beginning of the truth that's been hidden for too long. You've relied on people's silence to protect you. But silence is breaking, and once the truth starts to spread, even you won't be able to stop it." The cafe was no longer quiet. Customers leaned forward in their chairs, some pulling out their phones, recording the confrontation. Staff stood frozen in place, hearts pounding, realizing that they were witnessing something historic. Richard's friends shifted nervously, their smirks gone, their eyes darting toward the crowd. They had come to watch Richard humiliate a waitress, but instead, they were watching him unravel. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into," Richard hissed, his voice low but trembling now. "You'll regret this. I'll ruin you." Maya tilted her head slightly, her expression almost pitying. "You already tried to ruin me, sir. You tried to ruin everyone in this cafe with your cruelty, but you can't ruin someone who refuses to bow, and you can't silence the truth forever. That's what you never learned." Gasps filled the air again, and this time the applause began not quietly, but boldly. A customer near the front clapped once, then again, until others joined, and soon the entire cafe was echoing with cheers. Phones flashed as people recorded, capturing the moment when arrogance finally met its match. Richard stood there, his face red, his hands shaking, his pride crumbling as the truth pressed against him like a tide he couldn't hold back. For the first time in his reign of terror over this cafe, he looked small. Not because Maya had shouted, not because she had threatened, but because she had simply spoken the truth that no one else dared to speak. And as the applause rolled through the room, Maya stepped back. Her voice calm, her eyes steady. "This isn't about me, Mr. Allister. It's about everyone you've trampled, and one day the truth will demand justice. You can't escape it forever." The cafe erupted into cheers. Richard, once untouchable, now stood trembling in the center of the storm, his power cracking beneath the weight of his own sins. The walls of silence that had protected him for years were gone, and the truth, at last, had begun to rise. The cafe's light, the storm inside Beaumont Café, did not fade quickly. Even after Richard's furious words had fallen flat, even after Maya's calm truth had silenced him, the air remained thick with electricity. The customers whispered to one another, some still recording on their phones, while others stared wide-eyed, hardly believing what they had just witnessed. For years, this cafe had been Richard Allister's stage, his throne room where he lorded over the helpless. But in a matter of days, in a handful of powerful moments, a young waitress had turned that stage into a courtroom, and the people were no longer silent jurors, but witnesses demanding justice. Richard stood there, stiff and trembling, his fists clenched at his sides. The fury on his face was still there, but beneath it was something far more dangerous to him. Fear. Not fear of Maya herself, but fear of what she represented. If the people in this cafe dared to applaud her, dared to side against him, then his carefully cultivated power over them was crumbling. His friends who had come to enjoy his spectacle shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their confidence in him draining away as quickly as the whispers of the crowd spread like wildfire. Even they could sense it. This was no longer Richard's place. Maya did not gloat. She did not smile at his downfall, nor did she raise her voice in triumph. Instead, she stood quietly, her posture steady, her hands folded neatly in front of her apron. She knew the power of silence too, not the silence of fear, but the silence that comes when truth has been spoken and does not need to be repeated. It was Richard who fidgeted in the stillness, not her. Finally, unable to bear it, Richard grabbed the stack of cash he had thrown on the table earlier and flung it across the floor. Bills scattered like fallen leaves, fluttering under chairs and against shoes. "Here!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "This is what you all want, isn't it? Money. Take it! You think this woman's words mean anything? Money is what matters. Money is power. Without it, you're nothing." But the cafe did not scramble for the bills. No one bent to pick them up. Instead, customers sat firmly in their seats, eyes on Maya, their faces stern with quiet rejection. Even Marcus, the veteran waiter who had endured years of Richard's insults, stepped forward, stooped slowly, and gathered the bills, not to keep them but to place them back on the table in front of Richard. His voice, though trembling with age, was steady with dignity. "Not this time, Mr. Allister," he said. "We're done bowing." The cafe erupted in applause once again, louder than before, ringing through the chandeliers, rolling across the marble floor. Richard's face went pale. For the first time in his life, his money had failed him, lying useless on the table, rejected by those who had once cowered before it. Maya's voice rose above the cheers, calm and clear. "You asked earlier if I knew who I was speaking to. I do know, Mr. Allister. I know you've lived thinking fear and wealth make you untouchable. But look around you. Fear has left this cafe, and respect? Respect can't be bought. It's earned. Today, you lost it." Richard's lips parted, but no sound came. The room around him felt different now, not his kingdom, not his stage, but a place where the truth had finally taken root. With shaking hands, he shoved the bills back into his jacket, his eyes darting nervously toward the people recording him. He had come for a show, but it was his downfall that had been captured, and he knew deep down that the damage could not be undone. Without another word, Richard stormed out of the cafe, his heavy footsteps echoing like thunder retreating into the distance. His limousine roared to life outside, but inside the cafe, no one sighed in relief as they once did when he left. Instead, they cheered for the first time in years, not because the tyrant was gone, but because they were free from his shadow. Maya exhaled slowly, her hands trembling now that the moment had passed. She glanced around, meeting the eyes of the staff and the customers. Marcus stepped closer, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. His eyes were wet, but his smile was proud. "You did what none of us could," he said softly. "You reminded us we still had voices." Anna, the young barista, nodded fiercely. "You gave us back our courage." The customers chimed in, some calling out her name, others thanking her openly. One older woman at the front table clasped her hands together, tears in her eyes. "Child, I wish my daughter had seen this. You showed us all what dignity looks like." Maya's heart swelled, but she stayed humble. "I only spoke the truth," she said. "Anyone could have done it." But Marcus shook his head. "No, we needed someone who believed it enough to stand when the rest of us were too afraid. That takes more than words. That takes strength." In the days that followed, word of the confrontation spread far beyond the cafe. Videos recorded by customers appeared online, shared thousands of times, sparking debates across the city. Headlines buzzed with the story of a millionaire brought low by a waitress's courage. Some dismissed it as gossip, but others saw it for what it was, a reminder that arrogance cannot stand forever, not when faced with truth. Richard's reputation began to falter. Questions arose about his business dealings. Old rumors resurfaced with new weight. His friends, once loyal for the sake of wealth, began to distance themselves, unwilling to share in his disgrace. And Maya? She became more than a waitress. Customers began to visit the cafe not just for coffee, but to see the woman who had stood up to Richard Alastair. She was offered opportunities, better jobs, interviews, recognition, but she accepted little, choosing instead to continue serving with quiet grace. For her, it was never about fame. It was about dignity, and about showing others that courage was possible. The cafe itself changed. The shadow that had lingered for years lifted. The staff moved with lighter steps, no longer dreading the sound of a limousine outside. Customers spoke more freely, laughter filling the air where once there had been tense silence. It became once again a place of warmth and community rather than fear. One evening, after the rush had ended, Maya sat by the window, looking out at the fading sunlight. Naomi's voice came through the phone, full of excitement. "I saw the video, Maya. Everyone at school was talking about it. You're amazing." Maya smiled, her eyes soft. "I just did what I had to, Naomi." "No," her sister insisted. "You did what no one else could. You showed them that even someone ordinary can change everything." Maya thought about that as she hung up. She didn't feel extraordinary. She fed. Tired, human, sometimes afraid. But maybe that was the point. Courage wasn't about never feeling fear. It was about choosing to stand, even when fear tried to hold you down. And if she had shown that to even one person, then it had been worth it. As the cafe lights dimmed for the night, Marcus approached with a smile. "Maya," he said, "this place feels different now. Brighter, lighter, like it belongs to the people again. That's because of you." Maya looked around at the cafe. The staff cleaning tables, the customers finishing their meals, the laughter that drifted through the air, and she knew he was right. It wasn't her victory alone. It was everyone's. They had all stood together in their own way, and together they had reclaimed their dignity. She rose from her seat, tied her apron a little tighter, and smiled. "Then let's keep it that way." The night settled softly over Beaumont Café, but inside the light remained, a light born not of chandeliers or polished marble, but of courage, truth, and the strength of one voice that refused to be silent. And that light would not fade.